Well, welcome everybody to a new edition of the Art Business Podcast. And my guest today is linked to one of the two guests that appeared on the last podcast with Lindsay Dewar and Megan Corcoran-Lott. Betty Briceño, you're very welcome, Betty.
Thank you, David. I'm so excited to join your podcast. It's always a
She's
pleasure
just
talking to you.
absolutely, it's great fun. And thank you very much for being here today in your busy art world life, which we'll hear more about later. Anyway, Betty has just reminded me that she was in the same year as Megan, who was one of the previous guests. So there's a nice link there. And the more I think of the people in that year, there's probably some other people I could invite as well. So Betty Briceño is, how would we describe her? I think she describes herself as an art market specialist and advisor, as quite a lot of our MA Art Business alumni are. Just to remind you, I'm program director of the MA in Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And quite a lot of our students, I would say, go into this kind of, if you like, more self-employed freelance realms of art advisory, general art specialism. And you have found yourself not only working privately, I think, Betty, but also for various organizations. And I think currently you're based in Miami Beach in Florida.
Correct, David. So I actually, lots of changes going on in my life. Recently, I just moved to Chicago 3 weeks ago.
That's right. You told me. I should have remembered that.
No, it's very recent. I think when we talk, I was in the middle of the move. So I was technically still in Miami Beach, but I'll still be between the two hubs. But I'm looking forward to this new chapter in Chicago as well, with a very exciting art scene.
And we could talk about that later, about the reasons for the move and what you're doing. How far? That sounds pretty much north to south, is it? Or is it slightly east west?
North to south, and Chicago is a bit west, as well as the Midwest of the United States.
Yes.
It's a wonderful, it's a big, a big city, one of the main cities in the country, and it's well known, of course, geography wise, because it borders with the Great Lakes. Like, we have Lake Michigan right here, so I love that sense that you're still close to the water. I've never lived close to a lake. But it feels very much like, I'm Caribbean. I love being close to sea, and so that closeness to water is fascinating, and it's a big cultural hub. So I'm really excited.
Sounds great. Do you know how many kilometers it is as the crow flies, as we say?
So from Miami
to Chicago. We can look it up. There you are. There's a little challenge.
Look it up, but
just go onto Google Maps.
Yeah, go to Google Maps. But I mean, my partner and I did drive here, and it took us. We did it over 3 days.
There you go.
Yeah.
So a long way.
Yeah. So I think it's, it must be like maybe, I'm not going to make up a number just in case.
But you didn't drive nonstop?
We didn't drive nonstop.
So did you share the driving?
We shared the driving, yes. And over 3 days. So we got a little road trip out of it, which was fun. Yeah.
That's interesting. Just it's quite interesting. I love these kind of long journeys. Where were your two stops?
So we went, Florida itself is a really long peninsula. So we stopped at the very north of Florida, and in a very historic town called San Agustin, which was actually the very first city in the United States when the Spaniards arrived first in what is now the United States. So that's a very historic town, and it's very charming, and to see the old homes, and of course, again, close to the water, and you're just leaving the peninsula at that point. And then we stopped in Nashville, Tennessee, which I had never been in, and that was very fun. That true Southern experience, the food. We had good fried chicken from the South. We also had great barbecue there. That was when growing up in Venezuela. When I think of America, to me that's like a really stereotypical. When we think of the culture, but it really
country music.
Country music, exactly. The South. I always imagine like a handsome American man with a guitar, or
and one of those 10-gallon hats or what they're called.
Correct, correct. So
And
very
that was the,
documented.
was there another stop or that you then?
So then we stopped briefly. I didn't get to see much really in Indianapolis, and then we
Right.
continued to Chicago.
Interesting. Lovely journey. So that kind of links into the first question, which is do you have a favorite city? And obviously you're probably too early to take Chicago, but if you want to, you can use that.
It's still too early. I'm liking it a lot, but I would have to say if I have to choose one or top city would be Mexico City.
Hmm.
It's a city that is very dear to my heart. I lived there, as you know, and it's just a true, it has everything that a cosmopolitan city would have. It's of course one of the biggest cities in the world, over 20 million people.
Takes a
But
day to drive across, someone once told me.
oh yes, oh easily, yeah. It's very very chaotic.
Hmm.
But what I love about it is that I feel it has an identity of its own. Um,
Hmm.
it really, since the prehistoric, pre-colonial history, it has a pre-Hispanic history before the Europeans arrived. That it was a true bastion of that indigenous culture and so various. And then of course into contemporary times you have fascinating food and culture. Just there are over 300 museums just in Mexico City. Is
It's really
you
high up on my list if ever I'm there. It sounds, I
yeah,
mean,
it's yeah
I've spoken to other people, including students that live there or have been there, and they're always full of love of the place. And of course, it appears in James Bond, and as an exotic sort of location. I remember the night. Do you remember the Night of the Dead at the start of one of the
Yes,
Bonds?
exactly. I remember, and then I remember it from the movie too.
Yeah,
Yes, it's in El Zócalo, around the
yeah.
Zócalo. It's the historic center of
Center.
Mexico. And the
Yeah,
Zócalo is fascinating because it's one of the biggest squares in the
amazing.
world. Yeah, so that plaza, that main, they
Yeah,
call it Zócalo in Mexico. And yeah, it's just, and for that, especially that celebration of the Day of the Dead. Yeah,
and
it's just a
lots of public and private galleries, presumably.
yes, absolutely. And in fact, the public, because the model in Latin America is, of course, throughout Latin America is more hybrid when it comes to funding. So there is a lot of public funds that go. That's changing,
Hmm.
because of many cuts in public funding. But overall, it's a very important part. And in public art, for sure, one of the most fascinating places I love about the city is the university, the UNAM, the National University of Mexico. And the campus itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the
Wow,
art and architecture.
wow.
And just walking through the campus is a true aesthetic experience.
So it's like a
So
go-to place for tourists, which you wouldn't usually, other than Oxford and Cambridge, you wouldn't normally have in a city.
exactly, exactly. It's a go-to
Wow.
place, and the MUAC, which is the Contemporary Art Museum of the
Oh,
university, is also one of the top contemporary museums in the country, and has a fabulous collection throughout the year. Also, their temporary exhibitions are great. So, yes, fully recommend Mexico City.
yeah, must go, must go. And then the opposite of that, some kind of countryside. You spoke about loving water, some kind of countryside or oceanside location that you love.
Um, so I can name my hometown, Caracas. It's a valley
Yes.
back in Venezuela, but right there's a main mountain that to the north of the city that really frames it. We call it the lung of the city. Provides all the oxygen for its inhabitants. And
Yes.
but on the other side of that mountain, you have the sea. You have the Caribbean. So it was always very nice because the city itself is about 1,000 meters above sea level. So
Yes.
you have, and it's in the tropics. So you have this really nice spring, kind of spring weather throughout the year.
Wow.
But then you just drive maybe 10 kilometers and you're right at the beach.
Lovely.
Right. And so I think that growing up, that was like the getaway for the weekends. You're surrounded by mountains during the week, but during the weekend you just drive. And so I really have fond memories of those visits. And that's probably why I also chose Miami Beach after living in Mexico City, which is also a valley very similar to Caracas, and then London. Miami Beach brought that the ocean. It very, very. There's something about being close to water that I don't mind when it's
in
gray.
London, yeah. And in London, I live in Kew Gardens, which is very, the river is literally 2 minutes walk from me, and it's still tidal here, the Thames. And I would hate to be that far from it. I'd feel really claustrophobic to be, particularly in a city, if I wasn't near water. So actually, I was born on the estuary of the Thames, and I then lived in Barn. I can be moving upriver. So yeah, I'll probably end up at the source of the Thames.
That's terrific, but it's true. The Thames really does change the city. I mean,
yeah, it's. I think most cities probably are based on rivers, but just been watching highlights of the triathlon where they're actually swimming in the River Seine.
No, I remember right before the Olympics started that I saw in the news that the mayor of Paris was, diving right in to test the water. Yeah. So,
and unfortunately, of course, they had that opening ceremony where it was raining very hard, and of course they had to open the storm drains like you do in London or any city, and that brings some sewage into the river, so they had to postpone the triathlon. But it was a Brit who won it in the end. I don't know if you saw this very exciting finish where he takes over this New Zealander is running up. Is it the Champs-Élysées? Probably the finish, and the Brit kind of overtakes him with a minute to go, and no, everyone kept saying, "Oh, he's losing his energy. The Brit, he's going to lose bronze medal," and suddenly he got gold. So that was quite a surprise.
I have to check it out. I didn't get to see it, but yeah, those rivers. One of the things I enjoyed doing, of course, doing Art Basel in Basel, is during the summer is going in the river in the Rhine.
Yes.
That you have those bags that you can put all your clothes in. You wrap it up and it floats, and you just hop in the river, get in, and
it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
That is such a terrific experience. Yeah.
And sometimes it's very hot during Art Basel in June, and you just need to take a dip.
Absolutely. I love that.
Oh, well, anyway, it's lovely to hear about somewhere I really, several places I don't know. And I think probably most of the listeners probably don't know Caracas. And, Venezuela, as we all know, is undergoing some various sort of social, political, I don't know if you want to call them problems, but I know that has had an effect on the art world that we might touch on later on. But what about a building? Do you have a kind of favorite piece of architecture in the world if you had to choose one?
So I would say going back to my roots, because it's in terms of architecture, I may have not the most popular choice. Back home, I remember the brutalist architecture, which in Venezuela was a sign of progress,
Yes.
in the 20th century.
Modernity, yeah.
Modernity, exactly. So one of my own university campus, my alma mater for my undergrad, Universidad Central de Venezuela, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the brutalist architecture, an architecture that provided. Most of it is outdoors in the tropics, so you have this wonderful breeze throughout the year. In this noble material, very humble material like concrete, and cement. So I'm very fond of it, and even in London, I love the Barbican Centre, and
the National Theatre, of course, by Dennis Laston.
South Bank. Those they remind me of that architecture back home. And in Mexico City, Luis Barragan, marvelous, also 20th century architect. So I think that I'm a very modernist in that sense, consequence of my upbringing.
It's funny, isn't it, the way brutalist doesn't sound very nice and is usually used as a pejorative term, but it's kind of wrong when you look at that wonderful skyline of the National Theatre that cuts the London night sky so beautifully. It's just like looking at a Ben Nicholson geometric painting or something like that. You know, it cuts
Absolutely,
into that
absolutely.
space. Yeah,
I'm glad you see it that way, David, because I feel like a lot of people, of course, when you come from older cities, you know, like back to the
like
Roman
London.
Empire, like London, you know, it's hard because people see it, oh, this was
Yeah,
like post the war. I
yeah,
understand like how it could have different connotation, different
yeah.
feelings, locals. But my heart really goes to it. I really appreciate it. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. And
I
for me,
can
it's like the
understand.
opera of architecture, you know, taking very humble materials and making something beautiful.
And it's also interesting to me as a partly a Roman archaeologist in my background, because if you go around any ancient Roman sites that are quite well preserved, including the Colosseum in Rome, if you look at the barrel vaulted arches, if you look carefully where the plaster and later decorative work has come off, you can see the origins of the building process for concrete, which was pouring the concrete over wooden planks. And of course, the Romans left the grain in the wood because you weren't ever meant to see the grain of the wood as it had been impressed in the cement and plaster. So, of course, what Lasdun and the Brutalists are doing is deliberately using that beautiful wood grain as a pattern, as a decorative pattern for the surface of the concrete, as impressed by the wood. So it's got that
Yeah.
kind of connection as well.
I never thought of that, of that historic connection. It's such a good point to bring
Yeah, and of
out.
course the Romans didn't
I was
want you to see
hidden.
it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It
But
speaks a lot of
yeah,
now. Yeah.
yeah, and I remember a lot of people say they find brutalist artists like uncolourful and undecorative. And I remember Dennis Lasdun at the press conference when they opened the National Theatre. Uh, I remember this woman asking him, "Where's the decoration?" You know, very sort of sarcastically. And he looked at her and he said, "Madam, you are the decoration," which I thought was
I love
wonderful.
it.
I.e., people bring buildings to life, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then music. Is it is it what I think it's going to be, or you know? So if you had to choose one musician or one piece of music or something, you know, that you could
I'm
only
gonna
take
say,
back to your desert island on the Caribbean on your own, what might it be?
I can't. I have to. I am what I am. I come where I come from, and definitely the percussion has my heart as a Caribbean.
Yes.
So yeah, I hear drums, and I'm going like very raw, like rhythm. Europeans love harmony and all these sophisticated
Not all of
concepts.
them. Not
Oh,
all of
not
them.
all of them, right?
Yeah, yeah. I've just been, funnily enough, I'm listening to a lot of Peter Maxwell Davies, who was this composer that moved to the Orkney Islands in Scotland. He's dead now, but he was prolific. But his music's really, really difficult, but very beautiful if you persist. But he has an awful lot of percussion. You know, if you went to see his symphonies, the percussion section was huge. And no, I love percussion. And I'm just thinking of Bernstein's West Side Story, which is obviously a kind of little bit of a parody of the Latin thing,
But it
but
touches, but it does,
yeah,
but it's very accurate.
yeah, it has a lot
Yeah,
of percussion
a lot of
in some of the
percussion.
movements, some of the dance movements. Yeah,
And I love. I think Bernstein really nails like, yeah, that soul of the rhythm. And but yeah, I that's where my heart goes. I also, going back to my region, I love bolero. That genre is very, oh, my neighbors, excuse me, Dave, my neighbors, and my neighbor has a baby,
oh,
and
that's okay.
you can
I
hear the
can't hear
baby.
it. I can't hear the baby, but I'm sure listeners won't mind.
Apologies.
Suffer the little children.
So I love that genre that has a lot of melancholia and
Yes,
nostalgia. I think it's also
yes.
because I had to leave home after, the crisis in Venezuela. So this music that brings this, like fado in Portugal.
Oh,
I
yes,
love
yes. The
fado,
flamenco, the deep, dark
and
flamenco.
flamenco as well. So
Mm.
it's that, yeah, the
No, I get that.
how we can appreciate, of course, Latin America, we always see it as colorful and full of, you know, these upbeat, but
Yes.
we can appreciate that because we also have that contrast of the nostalgia and the saudade, they say in Portuguese, that longing, which
Yes.
we don't see it as sadness. It's more that
Yes.
beauty of the nostalgia.
You
So
you also get that in a lot of Hispanic literature, don't you? In Spanish literature, you particularly modernist Spanish literature, you get that Borges and not sorry, who am I thinking of? But you know, those Spanish poets, they have that very, very melancholic, nostalgic dark side as well.
absolutely, absolutely. And you name like Borges, we have like Pablo Neruda
Yes, that's yeah,
and
exactly. And the
and it's
visual artists to a certain extent, a lot of them delve into that as well, I would say, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. So
And
we
presumably your musical interests are linked to kind of dance as well. Um, I think probably more than a lot of other global cultures. Um, Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It just strikes me that it's sort of, a lot of Latin American music, even the fado and so on, is still linked to moving bodily movement.
It's true. I think it's very linked to the culture. I think
Mm.
in any celebration we have dance. I think that's one of the biggest cultural differences for me wherever I've lived outside of Latin America is that I don't conceive a social gathering without some dancing.
Yeah.
And so,
It's a
and
shame. It's a shame we've lost a lot of that, I think, in sophisticated London. You know, I mean, it's for the kids at the discos and raves and so on. It's a shame.
yeah, you have to go to a particular,
You'd have to,
um,
yeah, it just used to be part of life. You know, people would just start dancing in the pub and start singing. You know, people used to just sing before the days of jukeboxes and so on. They just sort of start singing on a Saturday night and then there'd be dancing. And there were a lot of kind of like social clubs where all of these things would happen in London. But a lot of that's died out now, I think. I think
yeah,
it'll come back.
it'll come back. We have to bring it back. That's why I mean, I love to surround myself with musicians and like you, and to talk about these topics too. I mean, my partner he's a classical musician. He's a conductor, so we talk about these things every day,
Wow,
and
I didn't know
it's
that.
so important. Yeah, and we talk about because the parallelisms between the two worlds, which you of course dive into all the time. I think it feeds so much into our own understanding of the visual arts
Yeah.
and the aesthetic language that we use when we appreciate the other art forms as well. Yeah.
It sometimes surprises me the number of my students who don't seem to listen to what I would call art music. You could call it classical music, but when it's contemporary, that's a strange term. But I say that it's as challenging as a lot of contemporary art, but it's very important, I think, that you do this as part of your experience of
Oh,
visual culture. The same with
oh,
poetry. You know, I think you've got to kind of do all of these things. You know, most of the living artists I know, they definitely are very linked to music and have musical friends in both art music and, you know, folk and rock, jazz. So I think it's very much part of being in the art world. I keep trying to promote it.
absolutely. And historically, right, we see all these great artists that were always, meeting and collaborating,
Yeah,
Stravinsky, Picasso, always that
yeah.
constant collaboration. But yeah, and I always love when people the same excuses that people use for contemporary visual art that they don't get it are the same excuses that they use also for classical music or
Mhm.
dance. It's similar to the story that you brought up about where's the decoration
Yes.
with modernist or modernist architecture. I hear it a lot when I go with Chad to his concerts. A lot of people are asking, well, where with contemporary pieces, where's the melody? And so if you don't have
It's
certain
interesting.
parameters or um, the yeah the things those elements that you're used to that
Yeah, and
know.
you feel very insecure if there's no melody. And listening to Maxwell Davis, there is no melody. You know, it's beautiful, but for reasons which I can't fathom. But there's no, because I'm not a musicologist myself. Maybe your partner might be able to explain that better. But I think he would understand what I mean. That he almost deliberately avoids obvious melodies, Maxwell Davis, but every now and then something comes through, and because it's something to catch on to, it really moves you because it's so rare in his music. So it's like soundscapes of Scottish, wild seas and the bird life and everything, rather than a little bit like Sibelius in many ways, but much less tonal than that. But it is interesting. You do find yourself struggling. That's why it's difficult to listen to, because we're so brought up from babies onwards to listen to melodies, and memorize music through melody.
I have to check him out because I really like Sibelius too, and I can see how, because I think how you explained it, I think that's how we approach visual art too. I mean,
Yes.
when we don't completely comprehend it and something suddenly surprises us, that's when we're enamored, or something moves us.
Yes,
So
yes. And of course, this is all linked to I'm writing a chapter at the moment on how was value created in the 18th century. And so I've been reading a lot of Kant and Baumgarten and those philosophers who talk about, and Winkelmann, who wrote the first, it's all about aesthetics and beauty. And of course, in the early 20th century, that becomes really crass to talk about beauty, and it becomes almost and that this is the kind of music, I guess, and art that we're thinking of, that something doesn't have to be attractive and beautiful to be beautiful. It's a paradox. Anyway, we're delving into areas that we all know about anyway, but it's interesting that the way these discourses happen and go in and out of fashion. But a work of art then or an artist, if you could only take like one artist or one work of art to your desert island, is that this is always difficult, of course, for my
this
guests.
is difficult, but I'm just gonna go with what the first thing that comes to my mind. There's something about minimalism, and maybe because I grew up in such a busy color, where there was a lot of things going on. But if I have to take one piece, I would love to take a Rothko with me. I wouldn't mind.
Yes.
There's something about experiencing a Rothko in person and just being in front of that canvas and just soaking in those textures and the color. It really, I can't explain it. And but like exactly what you said earlier. And there's something about I don't know, his palette that really, every time whenever I go to a museum and I can just sit in front of one, I'm really moved and intrigued. Yeah.
Yeah, you hear that quite a lot, that and it always surprises me, because I think how many other you don't often hear people talking about wanting to sit down in front of a work of art and spend a lot of time with it. And I often say, but you spend 40 minutes listening to a Mozart symphony, and you won't spend 40 minutes looking at a painting that might have taken longer than it took Mozart to write the symphony. And Rothko, I think, is one of those artists. You hear quite a lot of people saying it's very meditative. If they want to, they will go into Tate in their lunch hours if they're feeling a bit overwhelmed by work, and they'll just sit and meditate on Rothko. I think it's true. There's something about it which lends itself, I guess, to that kind of meditation.
Yeah, and I think also because in most big cities, you can just where your Rothkos are, so you can
Yes,
just go.
that's true.
I think it's like visiting the doctor, like your local doctor. You can just go and find a good Rothko. Yeah, and another one for me always does it is also Velasquez.
Yes,
Is
that's
just
nice
it's
actually, to
a
have an
very
old
different
master as well as
way,
a, yeah.
but it's just contemplating. Yeah, just that contemplating. To me is
Yes.
very important, and having the time to just sit and look at a piece and the detail.
And his
Yeah.
portraits, his sitters are very often almost contemplating you back, I find, with
Right,
Velasquez.
right.
So
Yes.
it's almost like the Abramovich thing, where you have to stare her out
Yeah.
for an hour. For an hour, that you kind of just find they're looking at you and contemplating you, and you're contemplating them. There's something about Velasquez that has that quality.
Yes, that's a good comparison with the Abramovich experience of, yeah. I haven't done it myself with it. My brother was in London once, and he actually was able. She pulled him out of the queue, and he was
Oh.
able to have that experience. I would die.
I think I would just start laughing. I just was never, we used to play that game as kids, and I would be the first one to start laughing.
Right. Yeah, me too. Me too. But it's something about, the portraiture specifically, but Velasquez does it so well.
And of course,
Um,
a painting can't, I think it's uncomfortable with a real human being and someone like Abramovich, but because they're actually living. And that's another interesting thing, isn't it? What is it that makes the painting not living? Because it kind of is living in some strange way. When
it's,
you're
it's,
like the Rothko it's heart's beating, isn't it? It's not just a
yeah.
static thing. And the same, I think, with those Velasquez sitters. It's quite weird, isn't it? What is it about it that makes it alive? Anyway, we're getting very metaphysical now. So no, but great choices. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about, yeah, I know some of your early educational background post school was you decided to study international relations, but also museology. Um, Maybe you could speak about whether you consider those are related or not, and also maybe how that led you to eventually wanted to study art business in London for postgraduate degree. So I guess international relations, museology, and then art business. Maybe you could embroider that.
Of course. So, um, when I was in undergrad, my dream really was to be a diplomat. I
Mm,
love there was something about, well, from a very early age, I loved languages, and whenever I traveled with my parents, I was always the not only the translator, but I was finding myself interpreting and always the bridge. My parents always had also had a very complicated relationship, and I was always in the middle, the mediator. So I love that aspect, and of yeah, the being a bridge between cultures and people. So I wanted to be a diplomat. Unfortunately, I did all the, foreign service training, and I did international relations in Venezuela as an undergrad, but I wasn't able, because of the crisis in Venezuela, to work in the Venezuelan for the Venezuelan government, since I was it got tricky in Venezuela. I voted against the government at the time, Hugo Chavez.
and then it makes it very difficult to go into that civil service. Yeah,
Correct. I was not able to partake. So I started working for foreign governments. I was working for the government of Canada for a while.
that's
But
right.
things got very, very tricky in Venezuela, and I needed to leave and forget about this politics. And my father had an art gallery. I always grew up in the art world, but I never thought that I would, make it a career. But when things got complicated, I thought, why not specialize in cultural affairs? And I still had the dream to come back and maybe be a, cultural attaché in an embassy for Venezuela. So that was the original idea. So I went to
Mm,
Mexico, and I did that program in museology and curatorial studies at UNAM. And I also worked for Pedro Reyes, the artist. I was a studio manager there. And Pedro Reyes really broadened my world to the global art market. And I was working with, his galleries, Listen Gallery in London, Luis Astrina in Brazil. I had in his galleries, in 3 different parts of the world. And that really broadened my perspective. And I saw that all my skills from this political world, I could transfer into the business side of the art market, or of the art world. So I did. That's when I looked into the program at Sotheby's Institute, and I've always loved London. Who doesn't? And so I thought, you know what, I could specialize maybe in the art business, and see where that takes me. But it wasn't really like a linear path. It was
mm,
mostly just following the opportunities that presented in
yes.
front of me, and try to trust that process. Also getting very metaphysical, but it is true, because in my case, it was a force. I had to leave my country. I didn't want to, and Mexico was an opportunity, and then London opened up as well. So, and it was really in London when I did the program that I realized, oh, all I did before was political reporting, and how, the situation in Venezuela affected economic interest of a foreign country. Well, I can do that for the art world. I can study context, how the macroeconomic and the political situation affects an art market. And so it all just fell into place. It was very, very I remember my lectures with you, with Anders, we were just talking about Megan, with Art Tactic. It was just so easy to for me to write a report about a piece when that I had been doing that, but in different scenarios. So that's more or less my journey in terms of how, yeah.
It's interesting because probably the majority of our students are almost the other way around, that they they kind of tend to be it is still very gendered. I think it's a shame that I've often spoken about this, that there seems to be more opportunity in the UK and maybe across the world, for girls seem to be pushed into studying art and art history more than boys, and it's often not possible for boys like to do history of art A level, whereas it's often there for, and I think that leads into the fact that we still have more people who identify as women than many more than as men on our programs. But it doesn't bother, that doesn't bother me, but it kind of bothers me if I feel that it's almost like an inverted sexism, that the boys are kind of not being enabled, if you like, to study art, which is a shame. It's almost as though art isn't an important subject on that, you're following that same path, so why would boys want to do art? Do something useful.
I agree with you, and even I think my own family fell into that, because I wanted to do something very different. My brother is the artist. My brother went to art school, and
yes.
So, but it was, my father expected him to do. It would have been okay if I said I wanted to do art,
yes,
but not the boy in the family.
Interesting. Yeah.
So in the end, my father, of course, but my father being an art dealer, you would think that he would support him in the beginning, but it wasn't the case. Now,
interesting.
Now everyone's happy, and my father's very proud of my brother. But it is true what you say, and about that gender.
Of course, the problem now is that we're trying to retain art history in schools anyway. It's just being taught less and less, other than in, if you like, elitist schools. It's just very, very difficult to study history of art. It's a big issue in the UK now. It's left the core curriculum, as has music. People have been arguing about this now, and they're hoping, I think, the new Labour government might actually, push these useless artistic subjects back into the curriculum, because, as we all know who work in it, it's actually a very important part of creative thinking. And I think you're a very good example of this, as someone that sees it as serious, because it's politicized. It can be very important politically. And I often tell my students, what's the first thing that someone like Napoleon or Julius Caesar does when they've conquered a country? They loot its art. Suddenly it becomes important, yet in times of peace, they're not so interested in it, maybe. It's a bit of a paradox.
That's so true. That's so true, David. And it's in those moments of crisis that we really understand the value of our arts, and it's what keeps, it's the legacy, it's our culture, it's our identity, and yeah, I agree that it's we take it for granted so much, but
definitely. And I guess it's a laissez-faire attitude in this country that if you start giving artists money, they become lazy and they won't produce good work. I think there's a happy medium, personally. Obviously, being an objective studier of the art market, I can see both sides. Neither extreme will work. It's like a hybrid thing, I think, that you've got to identify with.
And it's important to have that discourse too, because people that are on the other side that don't want to fund these projects need to see that there is a middle ground, you know, that, okay, maybe there are some things that we need to improve, not make it, you know, so relaxed, but we can, I think not now in the world, there's so much polarization everywhere, that people are not able to meet, you know,
Yeah, that's
halfway.
true. Yeah, I suppose we are living in a very polarized political world at the moment. Uh, this year, you know, by the end of the year, there's going to be some other elections, and that's going to be very interesting as well. We've just seen it in France at the same time. But your dissertation subject was, I guess, a good segue from that discussion. That you chose. Maybe you could talk about the process of selecting. I'll just explain to listeners that our students have to, you know, it's totally up to them what dissertation research subject they choose for the MA art business. And it's the most important part of the degree. It's actually the master's part of the degree, the dissertation. And it's the time when they're really having to work more on their own. So, you know, we encourage them to select subjects as much as they can that they're interested in, if you like, maybe for future careers, but also out of academic interest. So can you tell us about your choice of subject and why you chose that and what came out of the research?
Of course, David. So one of the reasons why, so my dissertation was about the shift or the migration of the Venezuelan art market. What I call for the research after the Chavez era, which was after 1999, when Hugo Chavez was elected president and all these new public policies came into place, the whole political and economic structure of the country changed, and the ecosystem of the art market changed. How most of the art world really left the country, or whatever state had to adapt to that new reality. And it had to do with when during my decision had to do with during the course, I realized this symbiotic relationship between the public and the private, and also between like how each part of the art world is working together, and the different actors are all gatekeepers in their way. But if one part of the system fails, then it affects the rest of the structure. And I found this wonderful thesis, PhD thesis by a professor. Her name is Victoria L. Rodner. She had just written a couple of years before I did my dissertation, her thesis in King's College about what she called the art machine. And it was this, how each component of the art, or of the art world, let's say the auction house, the gallery, the public museum, the private museum, the studio, every piece has its role, and how they come together to create what she calls the art machine in her thesis. And her case study was about Venezuela, was precisely the case of Venezuela, and how when, you know, you had a very strong art market in the region. It was a regional art market, but during the 20th century, Venezuela, you know, had some of the best museums in the region. The first Rothko to leave the United States went to Venezuela to be exhibited. So it was that level of, you know, the Rockefellers were there, of course. So there was a big collector base, a healthy art market. But when the political economic structure collapsed, then so did the art world. So anyway, what I did was I wanted to continue in a way her research. I contacted her and mentioned that I wanted to maybe have like a continuation of that research, but focusing more on that physical also migration, how now there were new art hubs based in Miami, Madrid, Panama, and somehow the ecosystem survived, but in a different way, with that not physical migration, not only physical, but also in terms of how the art market had to adapt, because there was no institutional support anymore in Venezuela. So that void that the institutions left, then the private sector or the commercial galleries had to fill in. So the commercial galleries became more of these laboratories, experimental spaces, and had to leave almost like that commercial side, posit to fill the void that the institutional left. So that was mostly my it was really when I went to London and during the program that I saw how all these different gatekeepers work together, that I realized that I wanted to maybe write about that specifically. Yeah.
I think that's so interesting that you talk about it in that way. I think a lot of people wouldn't realize that, because there's a kind of bit of a traditional discourse in the UK, for example, is that people studying art academically don't want to know anything about money and the market. And we've seen there's always been money, financial sponsorship by private individuals, leaving bequests even, to the public museums. But there's this myth that British galleries and museums, public galleries, are just totally public money. And, we know that isn't true. And I think what's happened in the new millennium is that the brand names of all of those sponsors have become much bigger in places like Tate, National Gallery, Royal Academy. We've seen a real sea change there. But it's a shame, isn't it, that people see that relationship as not good. They'd rather it wasn't that way. They'd rather the public, they'd rather someone sort of didn't have so much food on their plate, basically, is what it comes down to, that my taxes are going to pay for that. So again, it's coming back to this difficult ecosystem. It is very like ecological issues of nature, that, the butterfly flaps its wings and there's an earthquake on the other side of the world. I think the art world is just like that. It really is very interconnected. And I think that your research sort of really brought that to the fore, that symbiosis of all of these elements, both public and private, that you never realized were connected, if you like.
It's so true, David. And really, even me, like as a professional, when I started the program, that came from that background of analyzing these contexts. For me, it wasn't so evident either until I got to really dive into it through the program and understand it, as an insider.
Because even the lectures tend to be on one aspect or another. There's very few lectures that would actually show the way all of those things interrelate to one another. Maybe you could tell us something. You spoke about that. You spoke about that sort of almost like micro culture being almost, well, obviously physically transported out of Venezuela into other nations and cities and art worlds that pre-existed in those cities. It's almost like taking a plug and will the pins fit in the other country? Do I need an adapter? But maybe you could, did they kind of uproot and then try and reroute? What were the problems and solutions in doing that in a new city? Did it fit in very, very smoothly? Or would you say there were issues? Or how did they adapt to those new environments?
It's a very, very good question, David, because there's no recipe, and definitely it takes like any migration, really, it takes assimilation.
Yes.
So I'll put the case of I'll bring the case of Miami, which is the city I lived in for the last 7 years, and because there's a big Venezuelan population, there are a lot of art world population in Miami, and one of the things is that I saw is that Miami, it's changing, but it's still not a mature art market. So sometimes I find that especially dealers would come and expect these connections to happen automatically. They assume, for instance, if you have an artist and this artist is showing in a particular museum, that the museum would pick up the phone and call its dealers to have them on board for maybe sponsor the exhibition, sponsor a catalog, I don't know, contribute in any way, to the exhibition. That's something that happens everywhere, and it's a given. But sometimes the way it's done can change from one center to another. And even the language barrier too, the fact that a lot of these dealers maybe are not fluent in English, and now they're living in the United States. And just understanding also the government government hurdles that they have to go to. A lot of them wanted to bring public art to the United States, and it's not the same. I mean, there's a public process that goes into commissioning public art. And in Latin America, sometimes it's a little, it's you go through we call it the country roads, so it takes a lot of assimilation. It's not that direct, but I think because of that assimilation is when you have the opportunity to take an artist or a group of artists and really make them international, which was the case of, I would say, maybe some of the artists from the second half of the 20th century, great Venezuelan masters, South American masters of that kinetic art movement, like Jesus Soto and Carlos Cruz Diez, Julio Lepard from Argentina, who were seen as the Bridget Rileys of Latin America, but suddenly when you have these dealers that are now based in New York, are now based in Madrid, and that they can, position them in the same level of other big, more international names, then suddenly you take away this construct or this label of Latin America from the artist, and he just becomes a great modernist master.
Yes.
So I think that migration, yes, it comes with a lot of challenges, but it could also give an opportunity to certain dealers and galleries and artists to become more international. But also, a lot of them are left out. The ones that are middle, they're starting their careers, or starting to consolidate their careers, are suddenly left orphans because the museums where they used to exhibit no longer exist or are no longer relevant, and so everything they built suddenly is irrelevant anymore. So
no, that's a very interesting model. So because it's not just what happened in Venezuela. I think we could use that model, that structural model, for any, I'm just thinking of 20th century modernist Indonesian artists when you're in Singapore and you look at them, and and then it's easy for people from the traditional West and the Northern Hemisphere to we want to categorize them. We want a hook to hang them on. So we say, oh, aren't they like Picasso, or aren't they? Yeah. And that's the way that kind of works. But as you say, those artists it's going to be harder for the emerging artist who may be much harder to fit into any of those existing models, I guess. Because the galleries, the local ecosystem that you've moved into is going to want to know, oh, yes, this artist was already successful. They've got a big collector base back home. They're going to be less willing to take a risk with one that doesn't have that collector basis yet. Or that's just one aspect of that, I guess. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting sort of model to look at, the way people are absorbed, that we absorb other cultures into our own, and the way the interchange works. I mean, we were talking before this started about both of us have been in Venice for different reasons, different experiences, and I guess we could maybe talk a little bit about that now, about the way that Pedrosa, the Brazilian curators, who was director of he was director of the Biennale of Art this year in Venice, and quite controversial in many ways. But one of the things that happened is he introduced a lot of Latin American art, that's where he's from, into the Biennale, but deliberately showed the obvious brand names, Frida Kahlo, next to an artist that no one's ever heard of, maybe isn't even represented by a gallery yet. Maybe you could say a little bit about how that worked, both culturally, but also what is going to happen to those artists, do you think, that no one represented, but he had just selected because he felt it was important to give chances to people that would otherwise not be seen in an international. It's a bit like footballers being brought across from Latin America at a very young age. We all know the ones that succeed and they become multimillionaires and big stars and big brand names, but apparently there's loads of these kids that are just left destitute because they've moved across all these promises, and then they're just not picked by the big teams. And I think it maybe that's an analogy for what's happening with these artists.
I think it's a
Firstly,
great
maybe you could just talk about your personal response to the Biennale this year as someone who's coming from the Latin American region and culture.
Yeah, David, and I think your analogy with football is a perfect analogy of that, of how a lot of these artists are left behind. And I think that's why also, Pedro, also, like you mentioned, the curator for the Biennale this year, he did a terrific job, in my opinion, of taking these names that are already part of the global market, of the global discourse, and cross-promoting, using those names to cross-promote more emerging or names that are not well known throughout the traditional art market. And something that I really admire that he did is he did not use the label of Latin America, that, you know, that regional construct that really limits you. The title of Foreigners Everywhere, we could all relate in a way where in our different countries we have immigration. You could see it, and you could give it a really broadened breed, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that he looked into indigenous art from all over the world, not, you know, pavilion, and that related also to the national pavilions, not only that main curated section, but the national pavilions each brought their works from their indigenous or First Nations, you know, their indigenous communities, which I thought was a very clever way of him to bring these artists from the peripheries, in his case, his region, as Brazilian, as Latin American, but not frame it in that way of limiting, you know, but really broaden the scope. And like you say, big names like, you know, Kahlo or Carmen Herrera, Wilfredo Lam, these great modern masters that are in, you know, the top museums in the world, Tate, Pompidou, but putting them next to lesser known. And I really do think that for a lot of these artists, their careers are going to change after being shown in the Biennale. You know, I wrote down some names of fascinating artists I had never heard of. And I think it was very, very well done. And like you said, when we spoke before the podcast, that it was done in a non-pretentious way.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be hard to level the word pretentious at that, personally. Partly because so much of that art he was bringing in, and a lot of the indigenous art everywhere, was just what we have always, you know, I was talking to my students when we were there about it. We were having kind of like seminars on the spot. And I said, isn't it weird? Because you look at this and you think folk art, and you think, therefore, low art, that's something that isn't really in the high end. You know, it's not going to appear alongside a Picasso in a museum in the future. And I think it kind of challenged those ideas. And actually, the way it was done, and the way that maybe, you know, I was even going to use the word, you're kind of almost bombarded with image after image of this, what you always saw as folk art, using traditional embroidery and tapestry and, you know, naive techniques and so on. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, you know, is it really any different from Grayson Perry? You know, and we treat him at a very high cultural and commercial end level, you know. And that there were all these amazing, and for someone like me, I was also learning a lot from like my Latin American students who understood what was going on with a lot of the politics of those artists. you know, I was just enlightened on so many different levels about what's happening. And as you say, Latin America is actually, it's a bit like 154 Art Fair. A lot of people say to me, why is it called 154? I said, think about it. Africa's one continent. How many nations in Africa, you know? And it's the same with Latin America. It's something in the 30s, if I remember rightly. 30 odd different nations in one, a place that it's easy for us to categorize as one. But it was, yeah, I mean, and suddenly I was actually turned on, you know, I'm very, very turned on aesthetically now by colors that I used to see as folksy. And you see,
No, but
I'm a big champion for my own folk culture and folk music in the UK, which is also looked down upon, you know, because it's something obviously with bourgeoisie and moving into the city that you leave all that behind.
Yeah, no, but I love that you bring up the, you know, that comparison with Grace and Perry, because that's exactly how I see it too. How suddenly, if it's an artist from the more traditional centers, or, you know, from the West, then suddenly, oh, his naivete is intentional. You know,
Yes.
it's oh, he's naive, but it's intentional. It's not.
Yes.
It's not because he's
And
primitive.
intellectual somehow. He's
It's an
been through art
intellectual,
school. Yeah.
right, right.
He's made a
And
rational choice.
it's a rational choice, right? And I think that I'm glad that you bring up how, you know, with your students from Latin America, you could give it a more depth in the reading, because a lot of these artists would hid behind the naive aesthetic to get to the messages, like folk music. You know, a lot of political protests are hidden
Absolutely. Yeah.
behind, you know, these beautiful lyrics,
Mm.
and beautiful melodies, but it's really to you know, hide a deeper
There
underlying,
you
you
go.
know.
We got the easy melody, so we swallow the whole thing, but we
uh,
swallow it with all the substructures, which is very clever.
Absolutely, but you can, I think it's very easy when you have you know, and I don't mean to sound like, oh, too you know, complaining about the West at all. But when you have the liberty and the freedom to speak up and to make art however you want, you know, it's easy to criticize someone that has to hide, or has to, you know, um, hide certain elements of their practice, because they can be persecuted. So they have to hide under this more primitive aesthetic. I'm talking about like more contemporary artists that are
Yeah.
or from the 20th century. But yeah, I completely agree with you. When I went into, because even as a Latin American, sometimes, and a Latin American that works in the global art world, I when I see these more folk art, I'm like, oh no, we have better artists than that, you know.
Mm.
But then seeing it in the Venice Biennale really also made me proud of
Mhm.
that art form, and see it with completely different eyes. How context can change everything.
And I can almost self-critique what I've just said myself, coming from my background, that my Latin American students, for example, they said, "Ah, but you're still framing it as the other and as exotic." And I said, "Well, in some, you know, I think all of the things are working. I think that they're all there, but I've now seen other layers, and I do think that there are, you know, there's why do you have to be ashamed of partly promoting the art of a certain nation as the other? If people like it and want to buy it, and then the museums usually follow the market, and then they start actually taking it seriously and exhibiting it, does it really matter how you get there in the end? It's like I know it's a sort of pragmatist argument, but you know, sometimes pragmatism in the art world is what you have to accept. You know,
But
the means and the end. You know, and so yeah, of course, I see it like that because I've been conditioned to see it in that way, in the same way as you're conditioned to see the Western world in a certain way. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we should be very open about about what we call one another and how we see one another. You know, and accept those differences. And after all, you know, um, you know, you hear people emerging and making a big thing themselves about being like Native Americans, if I can use that term, or whatever term you want, first person Americans. And they talk about the average white American as an incomer, as a foreigner, you know, which is a shock, obviously, if you're such an American, but there's some truth in that. But is it actually, you know, can't we admire one another's otherness? And the problem, of course, then is the power. There's an asymmetry with power. And then, of course, we get into Marxist analysis of these worlds and so on. But I find all of that really, really fascinating, the way it kind of internets and work. And I think art has a way of cutting through a lot of that bullshit, a lot of that political bullshit, I would
Oh,
hope.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Well,
music's another example, you know, the Divan Orchestra made up of Palestinians and Israeli young musicians, you know, by people like Daniel Barenboim, who's Jewish, you know, and they're still going. I think they're still coming to the London prom concerts this year to make a point that these people still can befriend one another. They can avoid their difference. You know, it's art has a way of crossing those boundaries. I know that's a bit of a cliche, but I really believe it does.
absolutely. And there's a reason why it's cliche, because it's true.
Because it
And
happens.
yeah, it happens. And I find, you know, when we sit with someone that thinks very different from us, and we're always or mostly always able to bond over the arts and
Mhm.
sharing this experience, like you said, like just the fact that we were able to see that Venice Biennale exhibitions, and like you said, they brought you different layers, and I bet to your students too, and to
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what it's all about. Not negating the differences, like you
Yeah.
said, because we are different. We come from different backgrounds, but being able to see different layers to understand each other, or at least where we're coming from.
And
Yeah.
as you say, Pedrosa's strategy by giving it that rather controversial name, foreigners everywhere, stranieri ovunque. I mean, in this country, that I've got a tote bag from it, and I have to
You
turn it
do.
round
You turn it
because
around to the Italian side.
I think if someone can misunderstand that, if I'm
Absolutely.
walking along as a white middle class man
Yeah.
with a bag saying foreigners everywhere, someone can get quite offended by that. And I'd love them to come up to me, and if they don't punch me, knock me out first, to say, well, actually, this was all about deconstructing these notions of who is a foreigner. I would say to them, I'm the foreigner as far as you're concerned as well. It works both ways, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, all of us that have the tote bag have gone. Even I liked, yeah, it really was brilliant. I'm very pleased with the Biennale this year and what Adriano Pedrosa did. Yeah.
And as you say, if it leads to with a bunch of students, if everybody was reflecting on what they were seeing and what it meant to them in very different ways, and it was making everybody think, well, in what sense am I a foreigner then? Which was his big question. Question yourself. You know, you're in Venice. An Italian in Venice is a foreigner as far as a lot of local
Oh,
Venetians are
absolutely.
concerned.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So anyway, I'm aware of the time now. Maybe I could just ask briefly. Um, oh, I was going to ask you about the pandemic, but I think everyone's a little bit fed up. But let's finish on a more positive note, or it may be positive, but maybe you could tell us something about a typical day in the life of Betty Briceño when you're working, from when you get up to the end of the day, the kind of things that your work in the art world exposes you to.
So, well, I'm in Chicago now, but I have to refer to my life, because I'm in the transition in
Yes.
Miami. Um, during the last year, I was working for the city of Miami Beach in their public art program.
Hmm.
So in the morning, my day in the office started at 8:30. So I would get up really early. I like to have coffee and just contemplate. I need my time to
Sounds
just,
familiar.
yeah, sounds like I like to get up early and just, look at,
Good idea.
and take my time. Sometimes maybe a little meditation. If I have time, I would go to the ocean and just a quick dip, 20-minute dip, to start the day. Then head to work, and I actually worked. I could just walk, to work. It was something like 5 minute, 10-minute walk, um, and then from there, just the fact that what I loved about working in public art is that I could have a meeting in the morning with an artist. We're working on a project, to install in a few months. But then I would have to meet with all the contractors involved in bringing that art piece. And I would be a lot of those artists aren't even based in the city where you're installing the art piece. So you are their eyes, their ears in that location, and talking, from the permitting the city involves. Sometimes they have, big grandiose ideas, but it's all limited to the permitting involved, from that to the actual contractors inside. So, wonderful, engineers, architects that really bring this idea, they fulfill it. So I love this about my day, to your question, this multidisciplinary aspect, that I could meet in the same day with an artist, then an engineer, someone that specializes, I don't know, in a particular material, because that was the one that the artist needed for that particular piece. And each one brings so much depth to their craft and to their to their field of expertise, that I learn from each one of them every day. And then I have even better treats like these, where I get to talk to a former professor that I admire, and our conversations at the Institute were always fascinating. So I love communications. I'm a Gemini. I love astrology. So the fact that I get to meet different people, different backgrounds, and that really feeds my day.
It's what we were saying earlier about musicians knowing artists, knowing architects, and it crosses into sciences and engineering in the art world, as you rightly say. And when I think of, I often, when I'm lecturing on why is classical Athens often seen as, like, in traditional art history, as like a peak of development of the arts and architecture, and I say, well, it wasn't just those. It was the dramas, the tragedies, the comedies. It was their military strategic ideas. It was everything. It was their engineering. The architect had to know about engineering. That was the whole. Everyone had their own, what the ancient Greeks called techne. We get the word technical from that. Everybody had their own sort of talent, and everybody's talent was respected, and everybody contributed to that society and that flowering of that wonderful ancient city. And this is something one would love to see more of in our own modern societies, I think. It sounds as though you're living the dream.
No, but and that's why we have the way we see the world and our craft. It's really similar, David. And you nailed it. I love that, with that analogy with ancient Greece. I mean, in the end, the word art comes from ars, which is, it's techne in Greek.
Yes,
so it's
skill.
all
Yes,
about
exactly.
technique.
Yes.
So when people think of art as this abstract thing, it all comes down to the technique and how we're able to share that with the world. And we all have, our own creative processes wherever we are. So it's just a matter
and a mutual respect for whatever someone does. I remember when I first went to Italy as a student researching in Pompeii, I was amazed by how wonderfully proud the barista was. They stand there, great posture, very smart, wiping the tables clean, but not in a menial, And I thought back to London, I thought, oh, it's a shame, because people who do those jobs in London, they think it's a menial job. But it just shows that however you bear yourself and however proud you are of whatever you're good at, and being a good barista, we all become coffee experts now. We immediately don't go back to a cafe if the coffee's not made well. So, all of these things have these kind of hidden skills that we learn to respect with one another. And I think that's where the art world is so amazing, is that it is, a lot of people be quite surprised by what you've said. They think art is some kind of esoteric, non-real world thing. But as you say, particularly working with public art, it draws all of the, and in the commercial art world, you know, working in logistics, actually working out how to move a work of art from one location to another. Venice is a very good example of that, the Biennale. So our students have a little bit of a lecture on the logistical aspects of just moving this stuff in and out of the city, you know, by boat on the water, you know. There's challenges all the way through. So I think that's a really, really, it's lovely to hear that you're working within that as well. So just finally, if you were to give like any of my current students or prospect students who might be listening to this, if you were going to give them any advice about, you know, where you are now and how to get there in the art world, what might you say to them?
I would say to them that it's okay to have a plan. I'm a big planner myself, but you also have to be open to pivot, you know, once in a while, because life, you know, sometimes will throw at you a curveball, like, you know, like they say in America with baseball, and you have to try to, you know, be flexible in that sense that sometimes you're not seeing the open door because, you know, you're trying to follow that original plan that you had. And coming from someone that from an outsider, they might look at me and say, oh, she's changed career so many times. But
Yes.
I don't see it that way. I see it more like I was finding my path and responding to the context and the opportunities that life gave me. So I would say that, and, you know, have a plan, but also keep an open mind to see, you know, what comes at you, and listen to your mentors. You know, if people see a gift in you, listen to that, because you might not see it yourself. And that's very valuable, how others see you in a good way, you know, not to take whatever everyone tells you, you know, as written in stone, but listen to that, because they might see gifts that you don't see in yourself, and keep an open mind, and
Yeah,
just to explore the art world.
I think that's wonderful advice. I think you'd be a very good educationalist as well.
I appreciate
Because,
that.
you know, Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, you probably heard me say this before, but coming back to techne, he said the most important thing a teacher can do or adults can do with children is the moment that they're crawling as babies, you give them lots of different toys that are based on the adult world, building bricks, whatever. And you find what they enjoy playing with is probably their innate techne. He thought that we were all born with this skill, and that we spend the rest of our life sometimes getting very frustrated because we haven't fully discovered it. And some people discover it. But I think the job of the teacher, if possible, is to do as much that they can to expose that individual talent as possible. So you're quite right, but that's a two-way process. So I think you're right in telling students that they should be very strong within themselves and follow their own instincts, but they should also be open to what other people are saying about them. And very often those will be, don't you realize you're actually really creative? No, I'm not, you know. It's listen to people, you never know, you know.
Exactly. You never know. Just keep an open
You
mind.
never know.
You never
And
know.
that's why the art world's so exciting. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So Betty, anyway, on behalf of all the listeners, and you know, it's a hot day, probably where you are as well. It's very hot in London at the moment. I mean, relatively speaking.
It's probably in like the 20s here. It's not that hot.
Similar. Yeah, it's just the trouble is it's like 85% humidity in London, which makes it less comfortable. So, so if I look as though I'm a little bit, you know, it's because I am. I don't have air conditioning, so I have these old-fashioned sash windows, which are amazing. They're like, yeah, exactly. I'm sweating a bit. Anyway, thank you very much, Betty, and you know, maybe we can catch up again on a podcast in a few years' time and see and talk about Chicago.
Would love that. Would love that. Can't wait. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for having me, and lots of success with the program and all your wonderful projects.
Yeah, thank you.